CO2 and breathing out oxygen. And I'm going to talk about climate change today, and I'm going to, I tell you, it'll be depressing for a little while, and then it'll be a little less depressing, I hope. But one of the things I really want to talk about is forests and what's going on. I wrote the first book about climate change 22 years ago now, 1989, a book called The End of Nature. And I've been sort of keeping track ever since of this biggest of problems that humans have ever faced. And really, you know, we knew most of what we needed to know 20 years ago. We knew that burning coal and gas and oil produced lots of CO2, and we knew that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space, and we knew it was going to cause trouble. The only thing we really didn't know was exactly when, exactly how soon. And, you know, being human beings, we hoped that it would take a while, mostly, so it would then be someone else's problem to deal with, not ours. And unfortunately, it's not taking a while. It's happening way faster than even the most dire scientists really thought 20 years ago. Because scientists tend to be conservative by nature, you know, in their predictions and forecasts. And as it turned out, everyone was underestimating just how finely balanced the physical systems of the planet really were. So far, we've increased the temperature of the Earth about a degree, something like just under a degree Celsius. That's about 2 extra watts per square meter of the Earth's surface of solar energy. So 2 of those tiny white Christmas tree lights per square meter of the Earth's surface, which doesn't really sound like very much at all, but it turns out to be a fair amount of extra energy, enough to cause really dramatic changes. That's, you know, I wrote this book with strange title last year, Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H, and the conceit was that we'd already built a kind of different planet, sort of like ours, you know, same number of continents and gravity works and all of that, but now changing fast. Every physical system that you can name undergoing pretty dramatic flux. And the last year has been a kind of painful confirmation of, I'm afraid, how correct that assessment was. 2010 was the warmest year on record on this planet. 19 nations set new all-time temperature records. I was telling people earlier today that some of those records were really outlandish. We were on the phone with our colleagues in Pakistan who work with us at 350.org in early summer in June, and one of them said, "Very hot here today." And I was surprised anyway to hear him say it, because it's usually hot in Pakistan and no one remarks on it. And he said, "No, it's really hot here. We set the new all-time Asia temperature record today, 129 degrees. It is pretty good. I don't know did it reach 100 in Burlington this summer? Maybe just about. And if it did, it got anywhere close, then everyone in here was bitching and moaning and like, you know, about this. Well, I mean, add 30 degrees to that, and take away for 98% of Pakistanis the air conditioning, and you have some sense of what it feels like. And then, sort of just to add kind of insult to injury, remind yourself, if you're a Pakistani, that chances are you basically had nothing to do with this problem whatsoever, you know. When you have heat like we had, it manifests in many ways, and last year we saw all sorts of them. The Arctic continued to melt very, very dramatically. Right now, there's the lowest recorded level of sea ice for this date in February that there's ever been in the Arctic. Parts of Hudson Bay only froze over a few weeks ago, you know, long after it's supposed to happen. Last summer, both the Northwest and Northeast passages were open simultaneously. They had a boat race through territory that people thought humans would never navigate even a decade ago. You remember the pictures from Moscow of the amazing drought and fire across central Russia. Never before, ever, in 250 years of keeping records, had it reached 100 degrees or even gotten very close in Moscow. It was above 100 for 8 days in August. That's what triggered all those fires, but the real sequel, the real outcome, was that the Kremlin got so spooked by it all that they suspended all grain exports to the rest of the world for last year and probably this one too. Now Russia's the third biggest grain exporter in the world, so when they turned around those ships and trains and things, it didn't take but hours for the price of grain to start going up on world markets. It's about 70% up, with, among other results, some part of the tension gripping places like Egypt coming from people's inability to get enough food. Just can't afford it. Probably the most dramatic examples of what's happening in the last year came from changes in the hydrological cycle of the planet, the way that water moves around the Earth. If you want to remember one thing about climate change, it's that warm air holds more water vapor than cold air does. Okay? So the atmosphere is about 4% moister than it was 40 years ago, which is just a staggeringly big change in a basic physical parameter of the planet. And what it does is load the dice for deluge and downpour and flood. Some places are getting drier because there's all this evaporation going on, but once that water's up in the atmosphere, it's going to come down eventually. And now when it comes down very often in much more dramatic form than it used to. We got a little sense of this 2 years ago in Ripton, when we had, it was 6 weeks apart, the 2 biggest thunderstorms ever recorded in Ripton. 2 biggest rainfalls, just astonishing in July and August. Now Ripton, as I said, is a tree place. If there's any place in Vermont that should be quite capable of dealing with this, it's Ripton, except for the ski runs at the ski bowl. It's all covered with trees, every last inch pretty much. But that rain was falling on a different planet than that forest grew up on, you know. There was just too much of it. The town damn near washed away. You know, Governor Douglas had to come visit on a helicopter. Not that it helped all that much, but it's only now that we've, you know, thanks to the federal stimulus program, been able to rebuild Route 125 to kind of guarantee our, you know, continued access to the rest of the world. But that was nothing, you know. We're a couple hundred people stuck up in Ripton, what the hell. This year, the biggest example was what happened in Pakistan. Up on the Khyber Pass up there, it's an area that only gets in a normal year about 3 feet of rain. Well, the monsoon kind of drifted up and stalled, and they had 12 feet of rain in a week at the end of July. And that's the reason that the Indus River just swelled and swelled and swelled until about someplace around a quarter of the country was submerged. There's still, as of today, about 4 million homeless people in Pakistan from those floods. So, you know, 6 or 7 times the population of Vermont, still with no place to live because it got washed away. You know? And there are floods like that going on hither and yon. In the last 2 months, there have been 6 of these mega flood events. One of them you've actually heard about because it happened in a place with affluent white people with television networks. That's Queensland in Australia, you know. And the pictures are unbelievably dramatic, and the ironies are almost beyond belief. The damage is so big, they're talking about $20 billion or so worth of damage, that the government is trying to figure out how to deal with it. One of the first things they did was cut all $500 million out of next year's federal budget for renewable energy in Australia because they have to somehow pay. And one of the first things they have to pay for to get their economy back up and running is figuring out how to pump all the water out of the coal mines in Queensland so they can resume shipping coal off to China to burn, you know. As I say, but the same kind of scale of suffering, and in fact many more deaths in the area sort of north of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, in Sri Lanka, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, wild flooding of just the kind that one would expect in a world where we've gotten things out of kilter. So this drought, this flood cycle are really these are the kind of things that happen as a result of that, okay? The problem is not only that those things are hard to deal with, the problem is we've barely begun. The physicists and chemists are quite clear in their consensus that if we do not very dramatically move off fossil fuel way faster than any government or economic system is thinking of doing it at the moment, if we don't do it post-haste, that we're looking at 4 or 5 degrees of temperature increase in the course of this century. Look, if 1 degree is enough extra energy that the Arctic melts, we really don't want to find out what 4 degrees does. Everything we can project says that it will do bad things, really tough, difficult things. Things that really make the prospect of civilization as we know it difficult to imagine. In fact, it was the NASA team that 3 years ago gave us the number by which we work now in my organization, 350 parts per million. They said in the abstract of the paper they published that there was now enough paleoclimatic evidence and real-time observation of things like the Arctic to allow us to say how much carbon was too much, and the answer turns out to be the most important number in the world, though really very few people know about it. 350 parts per million CO2, they said, beyond that level you cannot have a planet similar to the one on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Strong words for scientists to use. Stronger still when you know that right now, wherever you are, in Burlington or in Benares or any place else, the atmosphere is 390 parts per million CO2. So we're way too high already and going up about 2 parts per million per year. That's why all these things are happening. It's not some future problem. It is a present crisis, indeed the present crisis. And one of the places where you can see that most dramatically is in its effects on trees and forests all over the world. So, for instance, across the mountain west of the U.S. and particularly of Canada, we've seen this incredible die-off of trees in the last 8 or 9 years of conifers. There's a pine bark beetle that's always been there. It's a native species, but it's always been held in check when the temperature drops to 30 below or so for a few days in the course of the winter. You kill off 90 or 98 or whatever % of these beetles, and so they do some damage, or damage may not even be the right word. They just play their part in the natural cycle of these forests year after year after year. But you can guess the punchline. It doesn't get to 30 below anymore very often in most of these places. Canada's just had last year the warmest winter ever recorded in Canada. And as a result, large populations of these critters are overwintering, and they're emerging every year to kill the trees. And if you get up in an airplane over large swaths of British Columbia and now way down the spine of the Rockies into the U.S., there are places where you can be, miles up and not see a living tree, just this sort of orange rust of dying trees. Now, that's bad because there's a lot of dead trees. It's also bad because they begin, instead of soaking in carbon, giving more of it off. If they catch on fire, which they're now prone to do, they give off way more than that. And indeed, it turns out that in forests, most of the carbon is actually in the soils anyway. And when you have dead trees or other disturbances, that soil carbon begins to be liberated too. The boreal forest of the north is probably the biggest forest in the world in extent, but the second is the rainforest of the Amazon. And equally important, or maybe more so, to the cycling of carbon and of moisture around the planet. An amazing, an almost unbelievable pump for moving moisture inland from the ocean. There have been, in 2005, there was the worst drought that been recorded in the Amazon. trees that the resulting carbon loss to the atmosphere was about the equivalent of 5 billion tons of the amount of CO2 that the US manages to produce in the course of a year with all the fuel that it burns. Okay. That was bad news. But it was a once, the climatologist said it was a once in a century or worse event, okay? An anomaly. Most years the Amazon serves to suck up a lot of carbon because of all those trees. Unfortunately, 2010, 5 years later, we saw a deeper drought than the one we'd seen in 2005. And we think, the final counting's not done yet, even more trees killed and even more carbon emitted. And when you've had 200-year events 5 years apart and they begin to look a little too much like what the climate modelers say will happen as you raise the temperature, you begin to get somewhat afraid that just as in the Arctic, we may have passed or be passing some serious tipping points here that we don't desperately want to pass. So, reminders of how crucial trees, at least in large numbers, are to the way that things work on this planet and how not to be taken for granted any of this is. And clearly, we are taking it all for granted because basically we're doing nothing to react to this situation. Our leaders, presented with all the data you could possibly ask, now for 20 years now, managed a kind of perfect bipartisan accord on doing nothing at all, you know. Last year, the Senate was actually presented with the most modest and mild and tame of bills to vote on that would begin in the halting, you know, apologetic way to begin to slightly reduce the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere, and they wouldn't even take a vote on it. It was too scary. Why was it too scary? Well, the reason it was too scary, the reason that we're getting nowhere politically, is the power of the fossil fuel industry, the power of the people who emit carbon into the atmosphere, whose business it is to emit it, and whose business model it is that they be allowed to emit it for free. If you think about why ExxonMobil makes more money than any company in the history of money each year, the reason is that they're allowed to use our shared atmosphere as an open sewer into which for free to dump their greatest waste product, CO2. So it's no wonder that they're doing well, you know. And it's become pretty clear that simply explaining to our leaders isn't going to be enough to get done what needs doing. That's been the strategy for 20 years, a kind of elite strategy that if we sat down the scientists with the congressmen and the presidents and things, that the message would get across, that the world is in trouble and something must be done. But it hasn't gotten across here and many other places either. And the reason, I think, is that in our political system, a small, tiny fraction of that money that those companies make is enough to warp the system and make it very unlikely that change will happen. To wit, some of you may have seen the article in the New Yorker last year by Jane Mayer about the Koch brothers, the third and fourth richest men in America who've made their money on all natural gas and who've spent a tiny bit of their money, since they're worth 30 or 40 billion, they've spent, you know, a couple $100 million, I guess, here and there, bankrolling every kind of right-wing cause you can think of and giving lots of money through these groups to congressmen. When I say lots of money, in relative terms, it's not even that much. The contributions are 20,000 here or 25,000 there, but that's usually the most that, you know, that make them the single biggest donor to many of these people, like Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma or whatever. And the payoff that they get in return is pretty much the right to keep doing what they're doing. So the House Energy Committee, for instance, met last week for its first sessions of the new Congress. 22 of the new 26 Republican members had been funded by the Koch brothers and others. Their first order of business in dealing with the biggest problem we've ever faced was to propose cutting all of NASA's funding for climate research. You know, well, it is kind of funny actually, but it's also kind of desperate. And what it begins to make clear is, I think we're going to have to build a real movement to make anything happen. We're going to have to figure out another currency to work in, because we're never going to have enough money to compete. And that currency is going to have to be bodies and creativity and spirit and passion and hard work, all the things that group like Branch Out Burlington brings to things. Movements don't happen very often. When they do, they're beautiful to watch. Every once in a while you get to see one that happens and works really, really fast. This thing in Egypt, this was a great model of efficiency, you know. 18 days later, they've pretty much done what needed doing, you know. There was a tough 18 days and so on, but well worth it. We've started trying 4 or 5 years ago to build a movement around, mass movement around climate. And it's taken us a while because we had no idea what we were doing, especially when we began. It started pretty much here in on the western side of Vermont, and there are people in this room who were there at the beginning when we did this funny march up Route 7 to Burlington for 5 days to demand action on climate change, and it was pretty good. And we got, you know, pledges from all politicians, not just from Bernie. I mean, what was the woman's name who was Martha Rainville, who was running for Congress? And she had said 2 months before, you know, she had put the office, she said, I'm not sure global warming is real, more research needs to be done, which actually I think now would sort of pass for a progressive stance within the Republican Party, but at least she wasn't clear that it was all a hoax, you know, more research needs to be done. Well, I mean, she came down to this rally we had on the Battery across the street and signed this big piece of paper we've been carrying across the countryside saying she'd work to cut carbon emissions 80%. I mean, the point was the more research that needed to be done was on the question, how many people will walk across Vermont and ask me to change my mind, you know? And 1,000 people, which is what we'd had wandering up Route 7, turned out to be enough. You know? It was good. It's the way it was supposed to work. The only bad part was to open the Free Press next morning and read a story that said that 1,000 people that gathered on the Battery was probably the largest demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the U.S. And when we read that, we thought, no wonder we lose all the time. You know, we've got all that you need for a movement. We've got Al Gore, we've got scientists, we've got engineers, we've got policy people, we've got position papers, we know how to do. The only part of the movement that we've neglected is the actual movement part. There's nothing there, you know. And so of course they pay no attention. So we set out to see what we could do about that. And when I say we, at the beginning, I mean me, who knew nothing, and 7 seniors at Middlebury College, where I hang out some of the time. And we had no money or anything, but they were very smart. And 7 was a good number because there are 7 continents, so each one took one. And the guy who took the Antarctic took the internet also. It's sort of its own landmass, you know. And off we went to work. And with the help of lots of people in this room and people all over the world, we said the first thing we're going to try to do is just take this number, 350, and make it part of the mental furniture of the planet, you know, really establish it. People said that's unlikely because it's a wonky scientific data point, never work or whatever, and which is quite a good point. The thing in its favor, however, was that Arabic numerals translate easily across linguistic boundaries, you know. So Vermont, Vietnam, whatever, 350 meant the same thing. And so we set to work, and we told everybody October 24th, 2009. Is that right, Joe? That was going to be the first day. We were going to really try to make this happen. And we didn't know if it would happen. You know, we had no real idea what would happen. I was telling a story earlier today, in fact. We got the sense that it was going to work 2 days early on October the 22nd. And we'd done these training camps for young people all over the world. And the first of them was in, we did one in Turkey for Central Asia and one in the Caribbean, but we'd done one in Johannesburg for Africa. And we brought a couple of young people from every country in Africa down to Johannesburg. Most had never left their country, most had never been on an airplane, but they were terrific. They were born organizers. We worked with them for a couple of weeks, and then they fanned back out across Africa. We didn't hear much from them, because Africa is really the one place left where the internet's still mostly notional. You can't just Skype people constantly, you know, the way you can anyplace else. But we knew they were working. And October 22nd, we get this phone call from one of these wonderful girl in Addis Ababa, 18 years old. And she and her 17-year-old sister, her name was Lily, they'd come to this thing in South Africa, and they were great. And so she's on the phone, and she's almost in tears. Mr. Gandhi, I'm so sorry. The government, Ethiopia has a not very nice government, the government has pulled our permit for Saturday. They're not going to let us do our demonstration. So we're doing it today to sort of get out, you know, before they can stop us. And we're really sorry, and we don't want to spoil it for everybody, and we know we're jumping the gun, and we really apologize. And there are 15,000 people out in the street right now, and I'm sorry. Because we were like, oh, Lily, the date's okay, don't worry. You know, try harder next time. But, you know, and so it was just wild like that for the next 48 hours or so. These pictures just come in, and before it's done, there were 5,100 of these actions in 180 countries. CNN says it's the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history, and the pictures are just, I mean, there's U.S. troops in Afghanistan. They make a 350 with sandbags. Send a note saying we're parking our Humvee for the weekend. Place after place. One of the things I want you to see in these pictures, I want you to see what your colleagues look like around the rest of the world. The equivalent of the people who are doing things like planting trees in Burlington, who are doing work all over the world on public health, on food, on women's issues, on the environment, who understand how all these things are connected. They're environmentalists, and the thing I want you to really notice, just as I flip through here, is that old thing that you've heard about how environmentalists are rich white people who have nothing better to do with their time, have solved all their other problems, just turns out to be a lie. Most of the people we work with are black and brown and Asian and young and poor, because that's what most of the world is made up of, you know. And big surprise, they're actually just as interested in the future as anybody else. And so the pictures just come rolling in from, you know, 300 big demonstrations in India. Some places we didn't even know where the pictures are. They're just too wonderful to ignore. And some of the places are really poor. These guys don't even have a digital camera. They try to develop their picture in somebody's home darkroom, and it doesn't come out very well, so they have to write in what their banner says. But somehow they're on the Congo River near Kinshasa. They know about this, and they've managed to get the T-shirt even. You know, you know, same kind of stuff going on everywhere in the world. That's from the Space Needle. Those are the colors of the Venezuelan flag. That's an operating room. Hopefully they didn't pause. Just amazing stuff everywhere. Deep involvement of religious communities. That's the head of Muslim South Africa, sort of native animist traditions. Next to him, behind him in the scarlet, Desmond Tutu's successor is Anglican Archbishop. They're at the head of this big multi-faith march. These are Pentecostal students in Ghana. That's Billy Graham's alma mater in Illinois. You know, that's, I've been to Bethlehem to organize, hard place to even get to, but the Dead Sea is just shrinking fast as temperatures warm. People are aware of it, wanting to do something. So the Jordanians said, we'll make the big 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll make the big 5 on Palestine. The Israelis Israelis said, we'll take care of the zero on our shore. You know, it was really nice. It was powerful. There were lots and lots of that kind of giant Scrabble. There's 10,000 kids in Delhi. It was taken from the Red Fort, those of you who've been to Delhi. You know, that's under the London Eye and in the center of Copenhagen. And just iconic places everywhere, including Syracuse football stadium. 100,000 people looking on, cheerleaders helping us out. You know. And we had a lot of activity across Egypt, and we've had the great pleasure for the last couple of weeks of course, all the same people who are doing this kind of work in Egypt have been in Tahrir Square and in Alexandria, and they keep, you know, calling up and telling what's going on, and it's exciting and powerful and magnificent. But just everywhere, you know. Really wonderful, really beautiful. Soweto, heartland of resistance to apartheid, they did 350 bungee jumps. But the best part, they sent us a note, said we hung the bungee line between the cooling towers of a defunct coal-fired power plant. This is the highest and best use for coal-fired power plant. That's one of my students in a time-lapse camera. You can't really see it. I just like that. That is my daughter over at the mountain school. Sap buckets. But you know, we did 300 of these across China. That's not an easy place to do this sort of thing. One of them got busted up by the police, but the other 290 some came off, and it was great. There's Chinese Youth Climate Network making a human wind turbine, and behind them you can see the edge of the largest wind farm on Earth there in Inner Mongolia. Just, you know, place F, that was the smallest demonstration. She started out with a lot of her friends, and they had to keep going through these military checkpoints and stuff in Iraq, and most of them got scared and went home. Remember, this was 2009, so anytime. But Ola kept on right to the start, right to the finish. She wanted to get a picture, and we've gotten to know her some since. Just a tremendous, tremendous organizer. But the same just all over the world. I mean, there's the Maldives, paradise on Earth, highest point in the country, 1.5 meters above sea level. You know, this country probably not going to be there 50 or 75 years, but boy, are they trying. Entirely Muslim nation. The premier, Mohammed Nasheed, taught his whole cabinet how to scuba dive so they could hold an underwater cabinet meeting on their dying coral reef to pass this 350 resolution, you know. The entire country is working extremely hard to go completely carbon neutral by 2020. They'll be the first nation on Earth to do so, despite the fact that they're poor. Just remarkable stuff. They got all kinds of coverage, I think because the images kept coming in from unexpected places. And they didn't look to our eye like what environmentalists are supposed to look like, you know. But, I mean, look at that zero in Yemen. It's all women in full black burqa. Those are oil-rich, that's the oil-rich sheikhdom of Abu Dhabi. You can actually see some oil-rich sheikhs if you look closely there. They wish to remain rich even when the oil runs out or we wise up and stop burning it. So you'll note behind them the edge of the largest solar array on the planet. Masdar City in Abu Dhabi is now the sort of ground zero for renewable energy research and development in the whole planet. And I confess there were also 600 or 700 photos just labeled 350 adorable. Just heart melting, especially when you figure that odds are those girls will be refugees by the time they're, you know, ready to have kids of their own. Those guys were all born the same day, so their parents met in the maternity ward in London, so they just thought that'd be a good thing to do. But from the sublime to the ridiculous, those were electric golf carts. Mostly just really poor places around the world with really, really great people. That's part of our crew delivering photos to the UN. Now, I wish I could tell you all this had worked completely. It worked kind of. We got to this big Copenhagen climate conference 6 weeks later. Lots of momentum. Indeed, they had on a Sunday,